different manner of things. So I'm going to come on to that in a minute. So effectively, we have lots of these ideas that there are these twin axes. There's biological evolution, and then there's culture history. And you get one, and then you get the other. And some people would say, well, they're two separate things, and people like Dawkins will say, well, actually, one is a continuation of the other. And so this is the territory that I address, go into in the book, is really what is the case. And my main intellectual, I suppose, scholarly point to write in the book is to reassert the autonomy of material culture and technology, and to show that it is actually its own, if you like, magisterium, to steal a phrase from Stephen Jay Gould. But what we've got to do now is track back a little bit to look at the historical background to the idea that culture is biological. And this goes back really to Darwin's Voyage of the Beagle, and some parts of Darwin that we might not wish to read nowadays, but nevertheless were written by him. It's easy to forget that Darwin was, if you like, a quotidian Victorian racist at a particular level. I mean, he was much less, if you like, belligerently racist than many of his contemporaries. He was anti-slavery. He was attempted to see the best in people, but he still wrote, having been confronted by the Fuegians in Tierra del Fuego and the Aboriginal Australians. I could not have believed how wide was the difference between savage and civilized man. He says it is greater than, I should say, that between a wild and a domesticated animal. The civilized races of man will almost certainly eliminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. And he argued then the gradation that linked the Negro or Australian and the gorilla with the baboon at the lower end and the ever-improving white and Caucasian race at the upper end, that is a slight paraphrase, but it is indeed what he says, will be erased, and in evolutionary terms, quote, the break between man and his nearest allies will then be the wider. You have to remember, of course, Darwin has made this massive prediction that human evolution takes place in Africa. Fantastic prediction, because he's got no fossil data for it at all. He's already rejected Neanderthals as potential human ancestors when lots of people were pressing for him to accept that, so he's quite right about that. And he's placing evolution in Africa, but he's no idea about the time date. And so what he's imagining is that there must be a scale of human races into which extends back to the great apes, and that some of the human races are not a concept that we like to use in the same way anymore, but he's arguing that this variance is along a scale. And he sees technology then as along the same scale, and notices the very so-called very reduced or primitive technology, particularly of the Australian Aborigines and the Tasmanians. There were no Tasmanians in Hobart when he arrived in 1836. They had already been transported, but they had a very reduced material culture, which we'll turn to in a minute. And Darwin saw that as arising out of a more primitive biology. So he argued that because they were both biologically and culturally less advanced on the scale of human biocultural evolution. Now this work led into, sadly, Darwin's work obviously led into the huge development of eugenics and the racist thinking of the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century in the hands of anthropologists such as Hans Gunther, for example, who was the leading race theorist for the Nazi regime. These are pictures of his from his book Racial Elements in European History, in which he attempts to explain technological development in wholly racial terms, including the fall of the Roman Empire, which is caused by miscegenation, interbreeding of Aryan Romans with other races from Syria, from Africa, and particularly Semitic races, i.e. Jews. You can see this is indeed a demonstration of why Rome fell, because it had people like Lucius Acilius Jucundus, a banker in Pompeii, who he describes as predominantly hither Asiatic, i.e. as a Jewish moneylender. And this has caused the rot at the heart of the Roman Empire. So these are models which we obviously wholly reject nowadays, but it needs to be remembered that this was the immediate legacy of Darwinian thinking in realms of history and culture. And the Tasmanians, I suppose, had a special place in this type of thinking. I should pass this around actually. I have forgotten I brought this, something I work quite a lot on Paleolithic art. This is a replica of the Venus of Willendorf, which is a carving, a limestone carving from the Wachau in Austria, that was made just over 24,000 years ago. And it's a masterpiece of limestone carving. I'll just pass that around because I'm going to talk about it later, but I should remind you that Heinrich Himmler wrote a little piece about the Venus of Willendorf, saying that she was a disgusting Hottentot Jew, and that this was what Europe had been like before German Aryan farmers swept down from the north and conquered Greece and invented Greek civilization. In Hitler's view, in fact, the Romans were German. So he had this idea of of master races sweeping around with particular cultural traits, which is what we're going to come to, bearers of particular technology, that they had the biological capacity to invent and curate and develop. I'll just pass that round anyway. It's a nice little object. The original is much heavier. And insured for 10 million euros. I think it's the most nervous I've ever been as an archaeologist when I was handling the original. But this is not a digression. Whereas in Europe we see Upper Paleolithic cave art, this sort of thing, emerging about 30,000 to 25,000 years ago, in places like Tasmania there was very little apparently to see. When white settlers moved in and started to oppress the Tasmanian people, they found that, they found people who either could not or would not or did not make fire. They lived completely naked. Virtually all of them had no shelters. They had windbreaks, but they had no houses. They had no multi-part tools. They had nothing. Basically, if you have an axe and you halved it onto a piece of wood with some binding and glue it on, then you've got an axe that you can fell a tree with. They didn't have any multi-part tools at all. And people like Darwin and people following in the Darwinian tradition said this is because they were intellectually, innately, biologically incapable of having a full level of culture. They were, in a sense, children of nature. Now, if children of nature exist, then that's sort of fatal for the thesis that I want to put forward in my book, because I want to argue that as a whole species, we are the products of technology and that we are a technobiological symbiont as a species. So if the Tasmanians are children of nature, I'm wrong. But I don't think they are, of course, children of nature at all, and indeed they do have artifacts. They are of what appears to be at first quite a limited sort. They also seem to get, quote-unquote, worse over time. Before 10,000 years ago, it appears that fishing was going on, and there was possibly a wider range of tools, and maybe, but we don't know, maybe they could make fire. Archaeologically, we've managed to look back and see what appears to be a loss of cultural traits, but some things clearly did never happen. Over on the left here you can see the European sequence over time. In fact, it's the African and European, basically the Old World lithic sequence, which eventually also characterises the later part of it